Hello and welcome to week 14 in Introduction to Sociology. Just these 2 weeks, chapters 20 and chapter 21, and then we're all done. So just a reminder that this week is when we have our service learning or information literacy papers are due this week. And so be sure to get those in. Those are worth a lot, and looking forward to reading that work from you folks. So let's go right into chapter 20. Where we are going to be talking about population, urbanization, and the environment, forces that have had an impact on our world. Now, I'm going to jump right into this notion of one of the topics of this chapter is urbanization and what has happened in our cities. And what we have here is urban development as it occurred in 1938. This is a 1938 map of Brooklyn, New York. April Fool's Day. And you'll see the different color codes have been used to designate different areas on here. And it's just really important as we talk about the mechanisms of urban development and what happened that produced a scenario, a racial discrepancy scenario that we refer to as redlining. You can see the color red all over this thing, and there's a very significant factors to what those red lines actually mean. So, as Brooklyn was growing, it was decided that there should be an assessment of property values for taxation, but also for investment, for banks to invest in areas and whatnot. At that time, the people who went out and did surveys of the neighborhoods and valued these properties believed that areas where there were more blacks and other minorities such as Jews and people from Ireland and from all over the world, particularly looking at the city of New York here, people from all over. They felt that those areas would lose value over time, so therefore were not good for speculation. From their perspective, this was simply advice, saying to their investors, don't invest in these areas because we feel that these property values are going to go down because of the presence of blacks and other minorities. That resulted in the fact that those properties did in fact depreciate. Banks themselves would not only refuse to loan money to individuals who wanted to come from outside and develop in those areas, but they would refuse to give loans to people who lived in those areas who wanted to develop industry. And you could probably imagine that over time, these areas would become increasingly condemned. People would move out. There's no sense staying here because I can't start my store here. The banks won't lend to these particular areas. The areas became neglected and dilapidated. Property values went down even further, and property owners were basically owning shells of their former buildings. Now, at the same time, because there was not a lot of people in these areas, and there was not a lot of property, and not the protection forces of the police tended to spend less time in these areas. So these also abandoned buildings without a lot of police around become place for people of criminal element to gather. So these areas, through this process of redlining, became more slum-like, became more filled with crime and the presence of people who committed crimes, and there's less police protection in those areas, and you can imagine what the property values were there. Now, another process begins, and this is ambitious people would say these properties are all really, if you think some of these properties right along, if you look at the top left-hand corner, that is Manhattan. So you're looking at this entire shorefront on the Bay of Manhattan with the Hudson River going right there. This is prime real estate from our perspective now. So as these properties became really, really cheap, the Developers went in, bought up that property, razed them to the ground, just tore everything down, and built, let's say, luxury condominiums along the river. The taxes would go up in the area. Any individuals who were still living there couldn't afford their own taxes on their properties. They had to move out, even though they might be next door in the same, not very well kept house. That's certainly not a luxury condominium. Their property values would go up simply because they were in close proximity to those buildings. They would be moved out, and many of the residents couldn't afford to live there anymore. More and more properties are bought up. And as that area became more and more dominated by rich urbanites, we enter into a process called gentrifications, where the old black neighborhoods that were redlined way back couldn't get any loans. They became dilapidated, crumbled, crime moved in. Property values were so low that it became actually a good business venture to buy up swaths of land that would otherwise be prime real estate, bring them right down to the ground, just rebuild from the bottom up, and thus make those areas very expensive again. The last of the people living in those areas would move out, and essentially old black neighborhoods became chic, expensive neighborhoods in this process that we call gentrification. This actually is current and present and still going on. And, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Still going on. And part of the gripe of Black Lives Matter is this process that occurred so long ago, so many efforts made. This is not new knowledge. This is knowledge from way back then that this was going on. And this repeated attempts to keep this from happening in order to get banks to invest in the people that are living there so they will take care of their properties better, build their own industries, create a rich and thriving and often more safe neighborhood. And yet those neighborhoods continue to be neglected depending on what phase they're in, unless there's these, buyouts of swaths of property in the building of luxury apartments and boutiques and whatnot. So now these forces of change, such as right here was urbanization. You're looking at one of the negative aspects of early urbanization planning, about what's going on and the longitudinal effects of that on in this case, a particular racial category. These are forces of change that alike to the original forces of change that we talked to at the beginning of the class. Globalization, urbanization, we just talked about, but in technology, and how these relate to the topics that we're talking about here in this chapter. Here we have globalization and urbanization contributing to issues of population growth, technology contributing to environmental problems in terms of, trying to solve some of those, but at the same time, contributing to some of those, and of course, population challenging our environment as well. Population itself on the planet, on April 10th, 2021 at 8:27 p.m., the official count, the total population of Earth was 7,858,207,853. It's larger than that now. So we have population issues, we have urbanization issues, and we have environmental issues. The planet is getting hot, global warming. So let's take a look at that particular issue. Along with all these other things, we have a planet that is gradually warming. Now the issue of the planet warming, of course, has suffered some very, sometimes hostile debate. There's no doubt in anyone's mind, really, scientifically, the planet is warming. The real question is, to what degree is this because of the presence of human beings and the industrialization and whatnot? And too much of the evidence is pointing in that direction for any real denial at this point. We are entering into what people call an Anthropocene era, which we have the presence of human beings had permanently changed the face of the Earth. So it's one of the characteristics I'm going to point in my slideshow here. The planet is warming at an unusual rate. It warms and cools throughout its history, but it's warming at a rate that is creating conditions that threaten some of our survival. And it threatens our survival in a number of ways. First, global warming is real. Second, we have the idea of Anthropocene, which we're in an era where the impact of humans is being seen visibly and chemically on the world. There's issues of water quality. Now, we need water to survive. We all know that. Water quality, clean water and clean drinking water is becoming a commodity, and there's not too many people, there's a small group of individuals who will say that the next great commodity is not going to be energy, but it's going to be that which we all need for simple survival, and that's water. They anticipate water wars. Issues with our air. These are basic needs. Land use and food. How much food are we creating? And how can we distribute that food in a way that's equitable and allows everybody to have a good quality of life? And finally, issues of energy, which tie into all of these. We need energy to assure clean water, clean air, and good use of our land, and making very challenging decisions in our world regarding these very threats to our existence. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. The assessments are discussion on redlining, gentrification, and Black Lives Matter. And an assignment, it's a fun assignment. Really like this one. And what I'm having you do with this particular assignment is locate in your local area, more likely in one of the more populous centers here. I'm thinking Augusta, Waterville, Bangor, Portland, those areas, but they're all over the place. Finding public space. Now, I talk about this sort of separate from the other topics that I've been talking about, but part of what city planning has been doing that's a little bit more on the positive end, it's often in that gentrified area, but not always, but looking at reusing space that maybe used to be industrial or residential or whatnot, and creating new green space within the city environment, recognizing that being close to nature, even when you're surrounded by concrete and steel, is important. And so at different areas in every city and town and whatnot, there are areas that have been dedicated to remaining green. Might be a manicured lawn, but it's green and it's open and not development, place to go and relax and enjoy fresher air, walk your dog, talk casually with people and whatnot. And I have a certain affinity to those areas not just because they're nice to be in and nice aesthetic additions to any city, but because there's usually a very, very colorful history associated with how it all came about, the individuals that were involved, what the land used to be used for, and what it's become today, and all of those things. So it's really, really neat to dive into the history of these. So what this assignment has you do is simply look in your local area to find one of these spaces, one of these areas of parks that have been created, or even just a single monument that's been created, and do the research. What is this about? What is it for? Where did it come from? Who was involved? And how did it all come about? Do a little history on that particular space that's there. So for some examples to that, here's this is Bryant Park in New York City, right downtown. I'm not quite sure if that might be a train station there, maybe. And Bryant Park, you see this right in the middle of the city. You have this nice green area, tables and chairs all over the place. People gathering, it's, of course, pre-pandemic. Right now, nobody has a mask on. But we think of these parks just in this area. I want you to take a look at this picture right here. This is actually the waterfront in Augusta. Look at this, the pretty picture here in Augusta. You can see Sand Hill over here on the right-hand side. You got the whole, this is Water Street, the backside of Water Street. And this in green space that's been developed here, there's a trail that goes, a trail that actually starts right here, eventually ends up in Gardner. You can walk all the way to Gardner on this trail. But the green space that's been created here, this is where the concerts in the park occur, the Augusta Concert Series and whatnot. Very pretty picture right here in Maine, this nice green space. There's also, live in Skowhegan, and they're working on the waterfront down here. There's some parks around the area, some woods that are designated for trails. There's plans for a whitewater park of some kind right in the eddy, coming right after the dam. And just some interesting areas in Waterville. There's a relatively new waterfront park that runs along the Kennebec. And just very, very neat places. So just finding one of those places and doing sort of like the history of and where did it come from sort of assignment. So get a little bit of that urban development that's in there. You could also, if you wanted to pick a restored building or like an old theater that's come back or something like that, I'd be into that as well. So depending on how you want to approach that. So that's your assignments for this week. And I look forward to getting those. And we're in the final run here. End strong. Get all these things done. Get your papers done. Get your service learning paperwork to me as soon as you can. And we'll finish up this class. And so I'll see you and have a great week.